Thomas Tafoya, and I chair this subcommittee, and I'm the co-chair of the overall task force with Tyson Johnston here. And we're getting closer on our recommendations, and we're going to be spending a fair amount of time talking about that today. And circling back to the conversation that we had in our last meeting with the Denver Regional Council of Governments, who were trying to talk to us about the differences in how we cut the data, right, between tracts or blocks when it comes to the census. We also want to start with the land acknowledgement. I personally am coming to you from the land of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, but my ancestors, the Cree Apache, the Pueblo, Shoshone, Pawnee, Lakota, Comanche, and 48 other tribes still travel through and reside here in Colorado. Important to note that Denver was a relocation city, and so because of that, we have even more tribes that are often represented here in the urban population. I think I saw here in the agenda, just wanting to go back over, if you click on there for all the public files for people to be able to access any of previous information. You can go to CDPHE, Environmental Justice, and then get into our drive and find our subcommittee. With that, do other task force members want to introduce themselves to the public or those who are watching online later? Should I call you out? Sap, I call you. I see you here.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out mute. Good afternoon, all. Michael, Sap, he, him. Proud to be on the EJ task force and looking forward to talking about recommendations today.
You want to jump in, Tyson? Yeah.
Yeah, Tyson Johnston. I'm also the co-chair of the overall task force with Ian, and I'm really looking forward to doing the work that is coming up. It seems like you prepare for this, and I've learned a lot, and we feel like we've made a lot of connections. It's going to be exciting to get to the work and to get some things down on paper.
Great. And I'm looking here at the list. Do we have any other members who are on?
Robin let us know that she wasn't able to make the rescheduled time. So the other member would be Renee, who I don't see. I think we can take care of sending her a reminder that the meeting's happening. So, but we do have 3 out of 5, so we are able to proceed.
Okay. Well, that being said, I want to welcome back Byron and Rachel from the Denver Regional Council of Governments to continue this conversation around census data reliability and identifying disproportionately impacted communities.
Great. Thank you, Ian, and thank you for having us back here to speak to you today. I'll start by sharing our screen. So we just have a PowerPoint again. Looks like I might just need to have that enabled by the host.
It should be enabled now. Do you want to try it again?
Yes, perfect. It looks like it's working. So let me see here. Let me get to my tab. My goodness. So many things are happening on this end. So bear with us for a second. Okay, so you should be able to see a PowerPoint presentation. Let me know if you cannot.
You're good.
All right. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you again for having us back. So the purpose of this is to follow up from our conversation last time, where we presented on data reliability, about census data and that data that goes into a potential definition of a disproportionately impacted community. And so we realized we kind of gave you a lot to chew on in that. So this is going to be more high level and more focused on kind of what we recommend or what we think the takeaways are from that conversation. So to give you an outline, we'll do a summary of what we presented last time, and then we'll talk about the big takeaways. So out of all the complex data, reliability, crunching the numbers, everything like that, just what are the big takeaways, and then what our recommendations are from Dr. Cog for modifying the disproportionately impacted community definition as it was written in the statute previously. Okay, so to start, this is a recap of what we talked about, but we at Dr. Cog looked into data reliability for the census by using the margins of error, which are built into that data. And so basically you have an estimate and plus or minus the margin of error equals a 90% confidence range. And so the example we have here is if you have an estimate in an area that says that the population below the poverty level is 100, plus or minus a margin of error of 20 means that it's there's a 90% likelihood that the true population below poverty is between 80 and 120. And so that's just a quick recap of what the margin of error means. And then that margin of error is assigned to every variable in the census. So for every block group, for every estimate, for every tract, for every estimate, there's a margin of error, not just for people below poverty, but for everything else. So people without a vehicle, potentially people with disabilities, anything has a margin of error. And so what we did is we took the proportion of the margin of error to the estimate to come up with a score that we just use to compare what is good or bad, what is more or less reliable. And so, for example, you might have a margin of error of 20 for an estimate of 100 people, and that gives you a reliability score of 0.2. Similarly, if you had that same, I forgot to put a dividing sign in here, but if you had that same estimate of 100, but the margin of error was also 100, then you have a reliability score of 1, which is worse. You want a low reliability score. So that's kind of a recap of the methods we used. And the takeaways from all of that, the things we really want to bring home is that the more people sample, the more reliable the data. And so we'll get into that with some of the examples below. The second thing is tracts are more reliable than block groups because they are sampling more people with that larger area. And then some variables are more reliable than others. And so notably, for potentially your purposes, is if you have percent of people below federal poverty level, that is more reliable than households because you're counting more, you have more people than households. And then percent people below 200% of the federal poverty level is more reliable than just the population below the federal poverty level because you're capturing more people. So those are the three big takeaways. And internally, what Dr. Cog is doing is we are going to map when we can at the tract level, use population when we can instead of households, and we're going to use the 200% of the federal poverty level. Again, all of those are more reliable ways of using the data. So those are our takeaways, and then I'll turn it over to Rachel to talk about the Senate bill and how we recommend changing there.
Yeah. So I have here the definition. I'm sure that you all are pretty familiar with this. So just on this slide, I just wanted to bring attention to two pieces in particular. The first is a line that says the most recent United States decennial census. And I think, so one of our recommendations you're going to see on the next slide is that this particular language is changed to refer to the United States 5-year American Community Survey. So the decennial census is only a 10-year product, and the data that this definition refers to comes out annually as part of a 5-year set of estimates in the American Community Survey. So that's definitely the data source that like us GIS folks would turn to find this data. So that's what a simple, pretty small recommendation we would suggest just to better reflect exactly where the data comes from. And then finally, in the low income section, so this piece is just a little odd and it's a very kind of minute detail, but you can see that they define low income as the median household income. So but when you think about a median, like the median has to come from a range of numbers, but each block group or tract, any area is going to have a single median household income for all of the households in that zone. But in the first paragraph, it's asking us to find the proportion of households that identify or that are low income, and that proportion is 40%. So I think just to think about the way the data is presented, each block group is going to have a number of households with income under 200% of the federal poverty guideline. It's not really a median. So I guess I'm just pointing out that that median word is kind of unnecessary and would probably make sense to remove that just to avoid confusion. So moving to the next slide, this is kind of to summarize pretty much exactly what our recommendations are as Dr. Cobb. And we're coming at this from a goal of bringing the definition as much in line with the precise data that is available. So this isn't any sweeping change to the definition, but really we felt the most comfortable just looking at it from the data standpoint as we have. This is what we recommend. The first thing is what I had mentioned on the previous slide, changing that United States decennial census to the 5-year American Community Survey product, which is again, just a different product, data product from the census. And then getting into each of those 3 components. On the left, you can see what it is as it stands currently. And we have the drawback that we've identified in the proposed alternative that we're sharing with you. So the text in green would be really what our recommendations are to you. And so kind of to go through that, the proportion of households with income less than or equal to 200% of the poverty line, with that proportion being greater than 40%. Our alternative would be switching households to population, just because that is the most reliable data that's available at the block group level. And then just a very minor detail is that the census provides that is less than 200% rather than less than or equal. So again, it's pretty minor, but just to really precisely reflect how the data is presented. And then similarly, similar change for a proportion of households that identify as minority. The drawback there is that survey respondents may not represent the entire household. So, and as it is more reliable, we would suggest changing that to the proportion of the population. So that's individuals versus households. And that's kind of the summary of our recommendations. As Dr. Cog, it was based on what we've looked into with how the data is provided, and as well as what we've learned about reliability over the past couple of months. And we'll of course send these slides to you so you can refer back to them. And our last potential considerations we wanted to toss out there. We don't really have specific recommendations we would make, but just wanted to provide some things that maybe you're already thinking about, maybe you haven't thought of, but that proportion of 40% to us, setting a threshold is always really difficult. So it's hard to come up with something that's meaningful, but 40%, you could see it as potentially somewhat arbitrary. Maybe that's based on the average, the regional average of the entire state. But we were wondering, you could differ that cutoff by variable. Maybe it's proportion of low income households at 40%, but cost burdened households at 30%. It doesn't have to be identical for all of them. And then that cutoff could also potentially be changed to some kind of comparison to an average. So whether that's above or below the state average, or if the data is meant to be looked at a smaller scale than the state, or it could be a statistical category. So the block group's proportion of low income people are in the top quintile or quartile or standard deviation above the average. So no specific statement on what's best or better, but just wanted to provide kind of things to think about with the threshold. And then again, I'm not sure what you all have discussed or are thinking about in terms of the variables, but I know many other states and organizations might use something instead of cost burden households, or might use additional variables. So just wanted to list a couple things that might additionally be considered. But I think we will leave it maybe on this slide and just want to see if there's any questions we can answer or hear any thoughts that you might have. But that's kind of all we have for today.
Well, thank you for this presentation. Since I've thought about it over the last month and a half or however long it's been, it does make sense, I think, to change from households to population, especially when you start talking about the impacts to population statistic size and the more data. So I appreciate you bringing this to our attention.
Yeah, of course.
Question I have in regards to the use of population, how does that work with kids, non-working adults? I mean, how does that work with all of that, I guess is the question that I have.
Yeah, we can, so I think this is something that maybe we can get back to you with some more research on, but I believe that the American Community Survey is counting all of those subgroups. And what I'm not sure is like the mechanism by which they get data on like a 4-year-old who may not be responding to the survey in person, but like their parent is or something. I'm not sure how those mechanisms look. But my understanding is, there are data categories that count children from age 0 to 17. So they're trying to count everybody regardless.
Right, and that they might be interpolating. I know they do a lot of obviously they don't ask every single person every single question. So they're applying some kind of assumptions. So they might be doing kind of interpolating those numbers from people who answer for their entire household and averaging or doing some other statistics to provide data for the entire population. Hopefully that makes sense.
How is the subcommittee feeling about using American Community Survey data instead of, the 10-year census data?
I'm more comfortable with the census data as opposed to the American Community Survey, but I've seen folks use both. I guess I would prefer census block data, but that's just me.
And just to maybe clarify that point, it is the census. The American Community Survey is census data. It's still provided at the census block group level. It's just a set of data that they publish every single year, as opposed to the decennial census is, the one used to redraw districts and do major population and household counts. But the American Community Survey is one, I think, that it includes more variables. So does that sound right, Byron? I think like a GIS person that would look at this definition and be asked to pull it all together would always use the ACS anyway.
Yeah, I think the decennial census is a short form survey, so it doesn't ask as many questions. So if you want to get some more specific data, it may not exist at all in the decennial census, whereas the American Community Survey has that. And I'm not sure about these particular categories being available. They may be, but yeah, again, it's like this is the data set that most people would turn to for this information, and then it has that currency of coming out every year, which is nice.
Yeah, so they definitely sample fewer people. I think it's something around 3.5 million households, maybe over a 5-year period are sampled for the ACS, and the numbers provided are, what is it, a rolling average of the previous 5 years. So the data set that just came out is 2016 to 2020, but providing data for 2020. Yeah.
I would just note that we do use ACS data as the sort of best data source that we could find for most demographic variables in EnviroScreen. Yeah, just using EnviroScreen as an example, we were developing it in 2021, and the 2020 decennial census data wasn't out yet. So we would have been using effectively like 11 to 12-year-old data from 2010 if we'd relied on the decennial census rather than the most up-to-date ACS data, which for most of the EnviroScreen development period was the 2014 to 2019 5-year rolling average. As Rachel mentioned, the next year recently came out, but that is definitely what we try to use as the best data source at CDPHE.
Thank you for clarifying that for me. I may have gotten it slightly confused, so I appreciate the clarification.
So I put in the chat there for you, Sap, a comparison of the two because I had to Google it just now too. And I'm curious, like, so the ACS asks more questions, but it's extrapolating based on a smaller sample size.
Right.
So would the 10-year, like when the 10-year census data comes out, that's the best data, right? And then after that, it's like supplemented. So like in 5 years is like in between is the ACS the best, but like right after the census is released, is that the best time because it goes to all the households?
Yeah, I'd say that the main limitation of the decennial census is just not having all the different categories laid out. I suppose if you had the specific categories you need, then that would be a good source. And then yes, the American Community Survey would be kind of your filler in the in-between years. But yeah, I think the strength of the American Community Survey is just that it has there's like thousands of tables that ask very specific questions that you can get drilled down to like anything you're interested in practically is in there. And then the decennial census it just doesn't have a lot of information. It's very reliable what it does have. That's a good question though. There's a trade-off.
Well, I'm wondering, like, this is a question for Joel because I'm not an expert on census data, and you worked on the EnviroScreen. Are the things that you need available in the census? They're not. Okay.
No, the census only has race. It doesn't have the income and household housing cost burden data. So we did sort of have to use ACS data for those two categories and assumed it was close enough to the statute since it does come from the Census Bureau. But yeah, it just doesn't have the information that we would need even for the 3 criterion in the statute.
Well, I mean, I feel like that speaks for itself. If we don't have the data available in the census, then I would say I would support a recommendation to rewrite to actually, have something that looks for the data that we really need to achieve the goal.
I'd agree. I mean, I think we need to make sure that this, again, because it's going to go in with appropriations and everything else of funds, all that stuff needs to be going to the right place. And if we don't have that definition, we don't have data to support that, there's going to be, a lot of people voting for money that they may or may not deserve.
And if I recall from the last conversation, there was also some conversation about block versus tract and whether we would be lumping in people who, like you're saying, would maybe access services or resources that they wouldn't necessarily qualify for, or like if we went to a smaller set. What are your all's feelings about? Is that accurate description, Dr. Cog, Rachel? Like, I want to make sure.
Yeah, I know in our last presentation we had discussed the kind of the difference between block groups and tracks from a data reliability standpoint, with tracks overall always kind of having more reliable data just because they do sample more people and they're larger. But in kind of, I will say in what Dr. Cog is doing internally, where we compared these three variables, the income, minority status, and housing cost burden status, to some other ones we're interested in for a larger equity assessment we might do. And these three are among the most reliable of that set. So internally, we've kind of come to the conclusion that for just these three variables, we feel comfortable mapping them at the block group level. So that smaller geography, it is tricky. I mean, it's census data. It's hard to say if it's super reliable, but at the same time, kind of it's the best we have available. So I guess based on that, I wouldn't necessarily say that we would recommend that you switch to tracks. If it were to switch to tracks, it would be more reliable, but you do lose some of that geographic detail. So, but yeah, I guess just internally, we've kind of decided that for these three variables, we're comfortable doing it at the block group level. I guess just as an example, we also are looking at people with limited English proficiency. That's another statistic from the American Community Survey. It's highly unreliable at the block group level. For that one, we've determined if we need to map that, we're only going to do it at the track level. But by comparison, these three are significantly better in terms of reliability.
So I just want to make sure I heard you right. You're saying tracks are better for linguistic isolation and blocks are better for everything else.
I guess tracks are always better. Okay. But these three are acceptable, I guess, is kind of more how I would phrase it. Because there is value in using block groups when you want to have more detail in how large of an area you're looking at. So,
yeah, I'd say like the other context for this is like Dr. Cox's region is obviously the Denver region. Mm-hmm. And so the reliability there is what we're looking at. We can't speak to the reliability of block groups and tracks statewide. That would be an interesting thing to see. And also just like for your own purposes, if you visualize just a map of tracks for Colorado and a map of block groups, that might help you see like how much better that detail is. But yeah, these variables for the Denver region at block group level look okay. Yeah. Okay enough to use block groups. Yeah. But tracks would be more reliable for the statistical side. But that's And yeah, it's just the more you summarize up, like counties are more reliable than tracks, and the entire state, just having one number for the entire state is the most reliable. But that's not evaluable. You have, like, if the goal is to assess and compare different geographies, you need some kind of level underneath the county and the tract. So yeah, does that help? Or
yeah, and I'm looking at the glossary here for just it's saying here that blocks are around like average around 500 households, and a tract can be up to 4,000. So when you think about, when you start thinking about it that way, that helps me kind of visualize the difference between, because 4,000 people in a rural area, that's a huge, that's a bigger block.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So yeah, if you it's basically like the more density you have in an area, the smaller all of those geographies will be, because they'll hit those population thresholds in a smaller area. Like one city block might be a tract in downtown Denver, but there's a tract in eastern Adams County that covers half of the county areas. So they vary in size, in spatial size greatly.
Rachel, I wonder actually if it would be okay if I took over the screen share and just showed Colorado Enviro screen so we
Oh,
can all
yes.
see census tracts versus
would
block
be-
groups for a visual.
Yeah, that'd be very helpful.
And while Joel's pulling that up, I was gonna say at a terminology point, there are tracts, there are block groups, and then there's also blocks, not to be confused with block groups.
Yeah.
And so that's just something to keep in mind. Block groups are bigger than blocks, tracts are bigger than block groups.
But blocks have, for privacy reasons, don't have any data other than total population count.
And so what I did here on the screen, here is the whole state showing tract groups. You can see there are some like entire counties. So I'll just zoom in on Southern Colorado, like nearly all of Huerfano County is one tract. I think all of Prowers County is one tract, versus like a block group is more granular for those rural areas. So I do think that in the rural areas in particular, it makes a big difference because you can see it's still some large swaths of area, but there are no, like, the whole county counts as like one area, for example. So I'll kind of just let everyone see the metro area as well. So again, we're still on census block groups, and then I will switch to tracts. So again, you can kind of see they do get a lot bigger, just for a comparison. So thanks for letting me take over the screen share there really quick. I thought the visual may be helpful.
Well, does anyone have any other questions?
No, I mean, I like I said last time, I think I found both presentations last time and today to be very helpful. And Joe, thanks for pulling up the Enviro screen and giving additional context. No, I have no questions at this time. Thank you for your time.
Well, yeah, thank you all very much for having us again, and we'll send that presentation to Joel, I think, just so you can all have it and reference it, and yeah, feel free to reach out with any other questions.
Well, thank you so much. It's really great to see this work actually happening after these bills pass, and you finding the holes and us having the opportunity to go back and fix them. I think it's a good thing the way this environmental justice work has been moving along, and we're just grateful, I think, for partners at all levels for their commitment to facilitating the change that the disproportionately impacted communities have been asking for so long. So Joel, I think we're pretty much on time. We're only like 5 minutes behind. We want to switch into recommendations. And do you have a slideshow for that, or are we just reading through this PDF?
Yeah, well, I will share the link to the PDF again, but we do have a slideshow. What I did is I actually kind of took some of the outstanding questions and put them on a Jamboard, which is what we've done in some of the other task force subcommittees. So this is a Jamboard that should be editable by all of the members of the task force and at least visible to other members of the public. And then we can, of course, type ideas in as staff. So me and Lubna and Morgan as we go through the Jamboard. So I'm going to first just kind of share the document of the current draft recommendations. It does not reflect the two that were just discussed in terms of kind of changing some of that terminology, but we are, of course, taking good notes. So here's the link to the recommendations. And then I will now share the link to the Jamboard, which is it's not a real Jamboard, it's actually just a slide deck. So, but it is formatted like a Jamboard. So again, that should be viewable by any member of the public, but only editable by the task force members, as well as the EJ program staff. So Michael, Tyson, and Ian, can you maybe just verify? You can type a little thing in a word bubble maybe on this first test slide. I'll share just to make sure it's working for you. Michael, Ian, Tyson, is that working? Are you able to type in that Jamboard?
It says I only have view only access.
Yeah, same here. I can't type in it.
And it's slowing my internet down, so I'm gonna be off camera to do them both.
Joe, Joe, can you send it to, can you put the link in an email and send it to me that way too? As opposed to just a chat?
Yes, I can. It is, I think it is linked in the email I sent out on Friday, but I can re-forward that really quick. Actually, sorry, that's too many things for me to do. Lubna or Morgan, would you mind forwarding the email and then just double checking the permissions?
Yes, I'll do that.
Okay, thank you. Don't want to slow everyone down while we do that. And Tyson and Michael and Ian, Lubna and Morgan, maybe just double check that everyone's both their task force email addresses and then private email addresses are working on it.
And I did request access.
Okay.
By clicking the view only and then requesting. And I just put my name in the comment.
Great. Sorry for the technical delays, but hopefully it's worth it to all be able to share a document. Great. Well, while we are hopefully getting that worked out, I will just say everyone probably remembers during the last meeting, Robin did offer to kind of put pen to paper and just draft up some potential recommendations, basically related to what we discussed during the last meeting, which was kind of having like a centralized set of criteria that could be that could apply to all agencies in the statute, and then agencies could kind of choose the criteria that work best for them. So I included, Robin did write that up. I've included that in this Jamboard for us to talk about. I've also included another idea that she kind of had while she was in the process of writing things up and put that in the document as well. So I will do my best to explain it, and she apologizes again that she wasn't able to be here, but Lubna and I have met with her and kind of heard her thinking on the topic, so we should be able to hopefully proceed okay without her. So with that, I will go back to the screen share, and hopefully everyone is able to access it now and we can get started. So can everyone see that okay? Okay.
Yes.
So the first topic I wanted to get to was one that maybe we've already talked about, but I anticipated that since we would be fresh off of hearing from the folks from the Denver Regional Council of Governments, we might want to talk about that scale and data reliability issue. So kind of the first question for us to brainstorm on is, how should we address the fact that data becomes less reliable at more granular scales like the census block group? So I will kind of stop there. It seems like there was consensus between the three of you that you want to keep the census block group because it's reliable enough for at least the three indicators that are in the definition now, and it's more granular in rural areas, but maybe we can get a quick thumbs up. Is that correct, that we will keep census block group for now? See a thumbs up from Ian. Great. And Michael and Tyson. Great. Okay. And then the next question is kind of the flip side, which is a census block group too big? There isn't necessarily a smaller option, but it is still fairly large in rural areas, and wanted to see if any of you had done some additional thinking. This is a question that's come up a lot of how do we address rural areas given that census block groups are really big, and for example, having a small component of a town included in a block group can then bring in like a big part of a rural area. And then conversely, in an urban area, you might have a situation where, say, a mobile home park is sort of missed and sort of overshadowed by other things in the area. So curious if anyone has done some additional thinking on that scale question with respect to especially the rural areas.
I mean, I feel like I asked those questions about block group, and that's the level that has the data we need. If you go smaller, it doesn't. So I think we keep the block groups even for rural communities.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely tough because you do have those scenarios in certain counties where you have large landowners, large ranches, wealthy residents, and then you do have a small DI community that sits within that block group. And will they be completely excluded? Or conversely, will there be that flip-flop of those people who are not technically in the DI groups being able to apply for funds and utilize this to their advantage? So those are the two worries that I have. The bigger you go, especially in the rural community, just because you may have, you can literally have a place where there's 25 landowners outside of the DI community, but that may take up 80% of the land mass. There's just going to have to be something written into the process of appropriations to take a closer look at that prior to.
Tyson, I'm not sure I want to pull a potential recommendation or a thought out of there. Do you think you could distill that down into kind of maybe like a sentence if you think, well, I guess the question is, do you think that means we should change anything in the definition, or you think it's okay as is?
I think it just should, maybe it should be explicitly noted that a block group is being used and that further investigation may be needed to properly identify DI communities within that block group in whatever application it may be. I think in all applications, whether it's appropriation of money, whether it's permitting or anything else, there needs to be a closer look based on the size of a block group.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on this question? I know we already spent some time on it, and appreciate you kind of distilling that down, Tyson. Thank you. Into the idea of further investigation could be conducted in the application of the definition. If not, I think we can move on to our next slide, and I will go back into slideshow mode and hope our typing shows up this time. So the next question is, how should we address the lack of census data reliability for communities of color? This is something that came up in some of our early meetings. I don't think we heard much about that from the Denver Regional Council of Governments, but we do know that Census Bureau data is less reliable for communities of color. And does that mean that there should be caveats or limitations to using it, or should we kind of continue using it given that it's there aren't a lot of alternatives, I guess?
Wish Renee was here for this one, because she was definitely talking about the Native American counting and the unreliability there. I mean, I agree, there's not much better data. You could, I guess, apply a multiplier of some sort, right? And assume that it's undercounted. And so I don't know. I don't know what you would do there. Snap, in your work that you did with the manager of safety, I'm sure the census block data or census issues and race came up a fair amount. Is there anything that from your experience related to that?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly did. I mean, again, we use census block data when we were doing our work in partnership with other agencies outside of public safety. You know, this is hard for me to weigh in on, to be honest, because I really would like to have someone, you know, I would like to have someone from the community weigh in on this, respectfully. Yeah, and it's having a little difficulty answering this question right now. Doesn't mean that I can't. It's just I'm very mindful, having been participating in the community engagement subgroup, what that really means, and that I'd hate to get ahead of, especially when we're defining definitions. And I really wish Renee was here to provide that some content.
I've seen some like stories. I just Googled one here from NPR saying that the most recent census had an undercount rate of about 5% for Latinos, 5.5% for Native Americans, and 3.5% for Black folks. So, you know, maybe we want to bring somebody back to present to us who's an expert in this issue directly.
I would welcome that. And I'm not trying to prolong anything like that. It's just I've learned a lot in participating in this task force, and I would hate to make a recommendation and it's not aligned with some of the folks that we're trying to serve.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's to just throw out an arbitrary number. That's how we get in trouble with a lot of this stuff, is guessing or assuming. I tell my kids that all the time. Stop assuming on anything, and this is something that's a little too important to assume. So I'd like to see some expert that has a little bit of data behind it, and then think about it with when we know the extent of that data and what that can or cannot accomplish. And if it cannot accomplish something, then we've definitely got to think outside the box.
This article that I just posted in here has someone from NALEO, which is like the National Association of Latino Elected Officials. It also has a quote from the Urban League. It almost makes me feel like maybe we would want short presentations from the perspectives of each of the different groups. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, and we can definitely take that feedback as your staff. I think that would be a really valuable kind of group of speakers for this subcommittee in the future. And to your other point, I think you're right that probably the undercount issues are really different for the Latino community, for the Indigenous community, for the Black community. I think there are probably probably some overlapping factors, but also really different factors. And if we're trying to come up with solutions or corrections, we would need to kind of understand those nuances. So I think it is probably worthwhile to have us as your staff do some homework and try to find some experts on all those communities, and maybe specifically the census in Colorado and how the count has gone for communities of color in Colorado, to follow up with you if we can. So.
Yeah, and this article doesn't talk about the Asian American Pacific Islander either, but I don't want to leave them out either.
Yeah, that's a great point. I had similarly seen studies that indicated there was less of an undercount problem for AAPI communities, but I don't know if that is nationwide, if it's true in Colorado, if there are other issues we should be thinking about for the AAPI. Sorry, I'm using an unusual acronym, which is hard on our interpreters, the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. So we can definitely look into that as well and see if there's some experts we could bring in about that community, or to address if similar undercount issues are likely or known in Colorado.
Thanks for doing that.
Yeah, ditto. I want to second that. Thank you for doing some more research on that.
It's what we're here for as your staff. So, so now I hope, is everyone ready to move on to the next slide?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So This one is Robin's proposal, and this is really a distillation that Robin put together of the conversation we had at the last meeting. It's pretty long to fit on a slide, so I wanted to kind of just, I hate to read it, but I'll try to paraphrase. But again, the idea is instead of having different definitions of disproportionately impacted community that apply to different agencies, there could be a single definition that applies to all agencies. And then Robin made some specific sub recommendations of that it could be sort of updated based on different factors, that each agency could essentially use its judgment to determine which factors made the most sense. So I think the example that was shared at the last meeting was that perhaps the Public Utility Commission is more focused on economic factors, such as folks who qualify for low-income energy assistance, whereas at CDPHE, we might want to think more about things like cumulative impacts and health effects. Additionally, that if I think Robin was assuming this would be mapped on EnviroScreen, that EnviroScreen should be sort of regularly updated so that it's kind of always clear and easy to figure out where the areas identified as a disproportionately impacted community are located. And then finally clarifying that a community identified by one agency is not automatically a community for the another agency. So that's kind of the option one that Robin wrote up, and I can do my best to answer questions about it. We again have discussed it with her a little bit. Option two is just having a single definition that applies to all state agencies. So with that, happy to answer questions or just open it up for discussion about those two options.
I like, it's interesting because I'm working, and I think I saw PUC staff on this call, and I love to kind of get their thoughts on this because they're having to adhere to Senate Bill 21-272, the PC modernization bill, and obviously the Environmental Justice Act. But me, speaking on behalf of, this task force, and this has like an end user, it does make sense to have just one single definition that applies to all state agencies. It just, for me, as a end user, it just seems a lot cleaner. But I could see where other agencies that may be problematic given their scope. But I tend to, in first glance looking at this, like the single definition that applies to all agencies. And I think the legislature, working with all the different stakeholders and agencies, could kind of figure out what that means.
The part that there are several questions I have, but one is updating the definition. And it's like, is that saying that you would create some sort of like regular review period to update it, and who would be responsible for that, and how would that take place? Something crosses my mind, because the legislature could always change it, right? But then do you want to set it up to be in a regular cadence, and then how do we, in this case, right, we had a task force that was put together that had all these interests. Like, is the idea to bring a task force back together to like reevaluate it? Because I think who's in the tables with legislators isn't typically impacted community members. Some of that has changed over the last few years through advocacy, but it's not a guarantee by any means.
Those are all great points. All great points.
And then EnviroScreen, you are going to be updating that regularly anyways, right? Like, that is that a recommendation that needs to be made, or is that something that we anticipate occurring anyways?
We are planning to do it, but it's fine for it to be a recommendation as well. One thing we haven't identified is like the cadence and frequency of updates. So if like there's a strong sense among the task force that it should be annual or every 2 years or every 5 years, or every 6 months. It would be good to know. But yeah, that is something Robin sort of included here that is already being planned.
It seems to me like it should be whenever the census data becomes available. And I think if we were to make a recommendation, it should be to resource the agency to actually accomplish this, right? Because an unfounded mandate doesn't always go where it needs to go because there's just not the resources. And I think if we could recommend resourcing the environmental justice staff to do this work, that would be my preference, I think.
I do like that sub bullet, and Tyson, I'm not trying to butt into your time, but I did like that sub bullet that Robin had around clarify that each agency should identify those DI communities affected by the action of that agency. Because each agency knows the audience that they're serving. And it to me, you know, they should, or they're working on their public engagement processes. Like each agency who they engage is very different. And so making sure that the agencies have some say, because they're the ones that have to implement the legislation. And so that kind of struck out as well. But just thinking out loud, and sometimes that can be dangerous. Go ahead, Tyson.
Oh, no, I think that's a great point, Michael. It kind of goes along with what I was saying, of, you know, looking at it closer as you get into your respective agency's actions, and making sure that they're being applied appropriately, especially when it comes to things like supplemental projects and things of that nature that will be funded. Those that should really be focused in on that. I did have one question, because I scrolled ahead in the slides and I didn't see anything in regards to, we did not really talk fully about the actual 3 definition pieces. And I wanted to bring that back up because there seems to be the reoccurring feedback that I keep hearing and getting is in regards to the housing cost burden and how that data is kind of skewed. You know, you got these big rich communities in certain places that have the housing cost burden of 40%. Is that, I keep trying to calculate that in my head and I just don't know enough about that. I'd be really curious to know, you know, how that affects the DI community definition. Does it actually grab more people, more DI communities that we're missing, or is it grabbing communities that don't necessarily need to be in there? And that one I've kind of looked at from a lot of different, but I don't have enough data to analyze that appropriately. It feels like if you're, you know, if your household income is really high and you're 400% of the poverty level and your housing burden is 42%, you're still, you know, at some point it becomes a personal decision, right? I mean, it definitely, especially when it comes to higher valued homes. You get into $1 million homes and stuff, and somebody's living in $1 million home with 40% housing cost burden. Well, that's kind of a personal choice. But I don't know if that's the norm or if that's the exception. And it'd be good to understand that a little better.
Perhaps we could get someone from DOLA, the Department of Local Affairs, the housing division, to talk to us about that component about housing burden. and how they do those calculations, because I would assume it would be like AMI versus average cost of rent, but I actually that's how I always hear it described, but I would be interested in maybe having Dola come.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you got to think about housing costs, but also think about energy costs too. Housing and energy costs with this gas commodities, even inflation where it is today, cost of gas at the pumps, and thinking about the timing of when these recommendations are due. Where will gas prices be in the fall, winter when folks are using it to heat their homes? And so I think the cost to me, housing costs and just costs in general is something that I think we should be, very mindful of when looking at definitions, and also just in all of our recommendations, because I, just worry about adding additional burdens to families who are in need. Because I think it doesn't matter what spectrum you are. I mean, when you get your bill in the mail and you see a $50, $70 increase on this gas in your house, that's a huge hit. And so just want to put that out.
I think that's a good point. Can we go back to the other slide about the recommendation with the PUC from Robin and her example? Because I've intervened from an environmental justice perspective, and if you only apply, say, factors around cost burden, then they're always going to make the economic choice of perhaps in keeping fossil fuels and burning coal in a community that the rates are high, but they would be higher, I guess, but they're being impacted by the health data. And I think we've been trying to get health metrics and public health into the PUC conversation a lot more.
I think that's a great point. And I think, but just to add to it, I think when it comes to fossil fuels, you and I know that because of legislation passed in 2019, whether it was the clean energy plans or the economy-wide targets in House Bill 19-1261, that utilities are working to retire fossil or coal-fired electric plants like Xcel, for example, with Comanche, with Pawnee, with Routt County and Tri-State is on a similar path, and it's all in our electric resource plans, because that's what that's what our legislators wanted us to do. And I think it's just understanding that climate change is real, and we all in this together. And so I think that you're right, but I just want to make sure that there's context too, that folks in this energy space are all working toward that same goal, right? Of trying to look at different fuel mixes other than just coal and like harmful fossil fuels like methane and others. And so I just wanted to add that component too.
So thank you, Michael, and thank you, Ian. I want to kind of pull us back to thinking about the recommendations. I think, Ian, what I'm hearing you say is actually maybe somewhat similar to what Michael expressed earlier. And I think what you also kind of expressed earlier, which is that maybe there is value in having a single definition, which would then mean that, for example, the Public Utility Commission would have things like health factors in its definition, right? The cumulative impacts prong. But to Michael's point earlier, the PUC definition, sorry, we keep saying PUC, I apologize, Diego and Isela, the Public Utilities Commission definition does currently have eligibility for low income energy assistance as one of its criterion. So perhaps there could be value. Is that what you're saying, in having kind of both of those factors, say health, a single definition that includes low-income energy assistance eligibility, as well as health factors that applies to all agencies. Is that, am I hearing that correctly, or am I putting words in your mouth?
I think you're on what I'm talking about, which is that if agencies, I don't want to use the word cherry pick, but if agencies pick certain factors and exclude others like health, then I think it's a lot more like business like usual, and environmental justice is so much about health.
You know, what would be really dynamic and cool is if we were able to figure out how to like really speak to health and like affordability, economic, all like in like one, like how we could like bring that all together. I'm not saying we got to answer that right now. I'm just saying, I think what you're saying is spot on. Like, how do you look at the cumulative health impacts, and then, but also how are you making sure that you're not pricing people out?
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to that. But.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if we're the ones that are tasked with that, right? I think that is why the decision-making bodies exist. I think it's about our job is to say, when you're making your decision, you need to weigh all of these things. And then ultimately the people who've been empowered by the governor or other methods, right, for decision-making through the government would have that list in front of them. And then that goes back to what I was saying in the early meetings about really needing to dive into the procedural rules of different agencies and how they make the decisions, because it's in that like decision-making criteria or grid or however metrics they use to make decisions and come up with it and score, that we need to make sure that the equity and health are put in there. And then we trust that those decision makers having all that information and being directed by the government itself to look at these factors would find that balance that you're talking about. And what we've seen, like in the fossil fuel industry, right, is that health and safety, where the balance was put ahead of the financial, right, with 181.
So Ian, I wonder if I'm gonna keep facilitating because we have so much to get through. I think that's actually a great transition, if it's okay, to the next proposal that Robin made, and it's even smaller font, so I'm sorry. But so far we've just been talking about the overall definition of disproportionately impacted community, which has a lot of different applications, right? Agencies are using that definition to make lots of different types of decisions. But one of the important decisions that the agencies will be potentially making as a result of this task force's recommendations is the equity analysis. And right now, most of the discussion in the equity analysis subcommittee has focused on conducting really comprehensive cumulative impact analyses that are focused on individual places that then can be applied by agencies in specific decisions, rather than each agency trying to do its own analysis that is equally comprehensive when making individual decisions like issuing a permit. So to that end, Robin, I think kind of this isn't something that was talked about in the last subcommittee meeting, but she was thinking more about that, and she realized that it could be helpful to have a maybe separate definition or a separate set of criteria that are identified that kind of identifies where we're going to do those equity analyses, because the definition of disproportionately impacted community is broad, right? Like it covers hundreds of census block groups across the state, and it would be hard to know kind of where to start. So she proposed essentially a new term that she was calling, just for now, overburdened community, that could be identified through a tool like EnviroScreen that identifies lots of different factors, right? It does bring together all those health data, the environmental exposures, and demographics to kind of create a single score for places, areas throughout the state. And then that definition would be used to determine where to do an equity analysis. So basically she proposed two options, and one is that the legislature could just identify the specific areas that should be the subject of the equity analysis that would meet that overburdened communities definition, or alternatively specify criteria that we could use to identify an overburdened community. So option one would be essentially the legislature says, okay, like you should, that these equity analyses should be done for like the communities that are above the 95th percentile in EnviroScreen, and those are like Commerce City, North Denver, Sun Valley, Pueblo, you know, there's a list, right? Versus like criteria that are used to identify it. So I hope I explained Robin's proposal well, and I hope it was actually kind of similar to the idea Ian was just expressing. And I'm curious what you all kind of think about it now that maybe you've had a chance to think through it as I tried to explain it.
Also, I just want to take a moment and let Renee introduce herself now that she's joined.
Hello, I'm Renee Mular-Chacon, Environmental Justice Task Force, Equity Analysis Co-Chair with Beatriz Soto.
Thanks.
You're welcome. And also just to add for the, instead of overburdened community, or that one's fine too, potentially having something that I guess addresses the intersectional nature of it, that also becomes more of a disparity. So whether it's lack of education, eventually even into that sector, because education needs to also be a key factor in this space as well. We need to recognize that one, educational needs for DIC is real with more privatization in our spaces, and how that legitimately affects sustainable energy for youth and future generations that will have to take on this space as well. And then other forms of intersection such as health disparities and housing disparities. And then one thing when I was listening is a group that the Native American Housing Committee worked with that could probably help maybe do a presentation or go into a little bit more detail about how to look at this through data analysis too, is Amatulik. They were able to do it with cross-references from lack of housing, different forms of data that worked in Oregon. And that's why Native American Housing Committee called them to help in Denver to, one, document Indigenous populations here, and then to see how they can see where there's been cumulative impacts in housing. But I think that they could help us in this space as well too. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And thank you, Ian, and all.
Renee, could you, this was the second time I heard you mention this resource. Could you pop that into the chat?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. And we actually had just, before you joined, had a discussion about kind of data gaps and undercounts of the Census Bureau for communities of color and Indigenous communities specifically. So I went back and added that recommendation on that Jamboard slide. Thank you. And Renee, do you have a term that you think would be better than overburdened community that kind of gets more at that intersectional cumulative impacts analysis nature of where this definition would apply?
I'm not sure yet. I'm trying. I'm thinking right now.
No problem. We don't have to put you on the spot, but if it comes to you in the middle of the night or later in the meeting, please let us know and we can add it to this Jamboard, or you can too. This should be editable by all task force members.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, let me think on it, because I would, or anybody, if you can address how it's more of an intersectional nature and then creates almost more of a disparity out of just returning to the status quo sometimes.
I know this is like a big concept that we've sort of thrown at you all. Does anyone else have thoughts on Robin's idea that there could be sort of a different definition or a set of criteria used to identify where the equity analysis should occur, and sort of preferences on those two options for how that could work in practice that she provided?
Yeah, I definitely think that that's a good idea. I've always kind of struggled with this in my head, is we're talking about how to define disproportionately impacted communities, but then as we look at it, there's going to be such a difference between, you know, kind of the direct impact, the secondary impact, and then the unimpacted, right? So how do we make sure that, again, the resources, because of the resources and the nature of doing you know, equity analyses and what comes out of that, it's, you know, often people just think about, well, industry's gonna have to do an equity analysis to get permits. That's not always the case. A lot of times it's gonna be the states or the cities or the counties or anyone who's doing any type of development project are going to have to do these analyses. So how do you focus to ensure that these analyses are being done thoroughly and on the impacted communities themselves that will be, you know, for instance, a Commerce City or a Pueblo, you know, in and around the facilities that are being constructed. Having that kind of heightened level of red flag, I guess, to say, hey, this does need an equity analysis because it is not only a DI community, but it's the direct impact of the activity that's going to be going on. That's going to help the agencies focus on where they need to focus.
So I have a question here. Outside of this proposal, would equity analysis in our minds apply to everything? And then this would be that this recommendation is to peel that, to carve that back.
What do you mean by everything, Ian? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, like, by everything, I mean like planning, permitting, right? Like, would they have to run that equity analysis? If it was in a DI community, they would apply it to any of the things. And then this is saying if it was in a DI community, but the score wasn't high enough, that they wouldn't do it. And this is her proposal, right?
Yeah, well, I think what Robin was proposing, and she also hasn't been to like the equity analysis subcommittee meetings. So, you know, this is based on her understanding of reading through the materials, but you know, where that group has been going, that subcommittee is going, has been like a sort of centralized equity analysis that is cumulative in nature, right? So it addresses air, water, soil. It thinks about exposures and health impacts, and it's very thorough and is sort of conducted in a centralized way by either a state agency or a contractor. And then decisions made by individual agencies are tiered to that analysis. So like I think you just rattled off the examples better than I would for what those would be, but things like funding decisions, planning, permitting, etc. So Robin isn't proposing to change all that. I think what she was thinking about is where will we do those analyses? Because the current definition of disproportionately impacted community is very broad, and you know where do you start, right? Like, do you start with like I'll pick on Prowers County because I was looking at it in the map earlier. Like it meets the definition. Is that where we should start our analysis? Should we start with and should we do an analysis for every single area that meets the definition? So I think what she was getting at was more like there should be like a separate definition that determines where those equity analyses occur, and then all not changing the substance of the equity analysis recommendation, but just trying to figure out where they should happen and essentially how they should be prioritized.
Well, luckily we have Renee here. So Renee, where's the direction your subcommittee is going?
For equity analysis overall.
Well, where would it apply? Like, would it? Because, and again, maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but the way I'm understanding this is like it's identified as a DI community, right? That's step one. Then step two would be they would check it to some sort of score, and if it did, then they would apply the equity analysis. In your committee, are you guys going in a direction of, hey, if you're in a DI community, you need to do this analysis on each of these things? Or would you say, hey, the first step is to check if it's a DI community, and then if it meets these criteria, then do the equity analysis?
Honestly, that would put a lot of burden on community to have to identify themselves and not enough on state and federal to take up what they should be. So no, not in that way. I would think that first that they have to be identified and not necessarily like on a scorecard or in a survey to where DI has to step up to say we are a DI community, but that certain, just again, where you see where cumulative impacts, housing impact, environmental impact, health impact, education impact, where it starts noticing those red flags more and more and more of cumulative nature, where there's the loss of equity. Does that make sense? But no, like, I'm sorry, I don't know if I understand your question.
Maybe
Well,
go ahead, Tyson.
well, and I guess maybe from a practical standpoint, as far as, you know, the application, I think if we get too far in the weeds on the application piece right now, it's probably going to make it really difficult, because I think, again, each agency is going to have to use this definition in an applicable way, correct? So if somebody wants to expand a water treatment facility in, you know, in Commerce City, for instance, that community has a lot of burden on it already, right? It is a DI community. It is going to have an equity analysis, but there should be something that says, hey, FYI, not only are you doing an equity analysis, but this is also a community that's being impacted by water, by air, by, you know, all of these things. You know, does that, if I was from a regulatory agency, I would probably put more requirements in that equity analysis and or you know, alternative mitigation or other projects to ensure that those people are protected, because they're already going through a lot of burdens, right? It's like,
Yes, to be able to, like, let's say land use, to know which state and federal agency is going to help monitor land use and where they're going to implement, let's say they're proposing a project for the next 5 to 10 years, what type of harm or cumulative impact, negative, positive, or neutral, is going to impact the already known DI community, and to go from there. But it's hard to know right now how it's going to implement, but the best way we can look is what is going to be long-term sustainability for the community, where we have to still keep in mind, we're for the first time, we're kind of having institutions bend to community in a way that hasn't been seen, especially to even recognize DI communities. So we need to see where one, there's data gaps, two, there hasn't been forms of any form of equity to analyze or compare yet to begin with. And then to where actually to start building these baselines to where this is an equity analysis that now we know where there's land use, they can't implement projects past this because it's going to cause this and this harm to, let's say the cannabis industry wants to build another grow house in Commerce City. They can't because it's going to add more nitrogen to that space. Things like that, where you can actually start seeing where industry and other sectors start imposing too much risk on those communities. Did that help?
It does help. We're getting good notes on this, and I think this is really helpful for thinking about the substance of the equity analysis. You know, I wonder if we can come back to the question, and maybe I'll try to frame it more simply. And Ian, to your question, I agree with Renee that the equity analysis subcommittee, in my recollection, really hasn't discussed that question yet of like, what are the criteria that will lead to an equity analysis being conducted in a specific area, which I think is maybe why Robin had this idea. But I wonder, could we do just a quick thumbs up of folks who think there should be a different set of criteria or definition identified by the task force for where an equity analysis would be conducted that's separate from the definition? So if you put your thumb up, it would mean, yes, I think that's a good idea. And essentially the concept of Robin's proposal makes sense to me, that there should be different criteria for the equity analysis that could essentially be a different definition. If you don't put your thumb up, I'll assume you think, it doesn't need to be a different one. So thumbs up on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, if you agree with the concept.
Joel, it's
Not-
hard for me to say. It's hard for me to say. I think to Tyson's point earlier, it's just, I need to see more on the equity analysis to be able to say yay or nay on it. I think we're all in agreement, right? I think Tyson's analysis of the water example and Commerce City, right, would automatically trigger a lot of red flags, obviously, for all of the right reasons. I don't know if I'm quite there yet to say that should be in a definition. I just need to see more from the equity analysis group. And again, I'm not trying to push the ball down the field. I just want to have comprehensive docs in front of me before I make a decision.
Absolutely, that is very valid. And maybe I'll just say we're a week away from our full task force meeting where all the subcommittees will come together and we'll be talking through the recommendations from every single group. And that will really afford us a good opportunity for you all to think through that. And maybe the four of you can be charged with thinking and being proactive in that meeting with saying like, okay, here's what I think the criteria should be, or like, you know, when we know more about the equity analysis. So I will move us on.
And that meeting will be in person next week too.
It will be, yeah, in person for those of folks who are joining us from the public, in person, Eagle Point Rec Center, Commerce City. Lots of information about how you can join virtually or in person on our website. Thank you, Morgan. You just popped up on camera for all your work in organizing that, as well as Lubna. So the next question is shifting back to the main definition. So these are no longer Robin's proposals. These are kind of continuing to work through the outstanding questions that have come up in past subcommittee meetings. And one that we've sort of talked about a little bit is the idea that we should be using Colorado EnviroScreen to identify areas that meet what we call the cumulative impacts prong of the definition of disproportionately impacted community. So that is communities, I'm sorry, I'm in the office, so I don't have my statute in front of me, but essentially communities that are impacted by many sources of pollution, as well as have a variety of health issues associated with environmental causes. So we've created EnviroScreen as a tool to identify those communities, but something that I think we've always thought we could get more input on from the task force is kind of identifying a threshold within EnviroScreen, and whether, you know, an area above 80th percentile in EnviroScreen, or 90th percentile, or 95th, or 50th, or 75th, it could be any number, should kind of be used by us at CDPHE or by staff at other agencies to identify communities that meet the definition. So let me know if you have further questions, and I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on that point.
My further question is, do you have a cheat sheet created for how the score is calculated and how the scores are weighted for creating that? That would be helpful to me, because that's something I'm still having trouble getting my head around.
We will have one that is part of the technical supporting documentation that rolls out with the final version of the tool when we launch it 2 weeks from today on June 28th, that runs through all the full methodology and scoring. Yeah,
then in that case, I would say that I would hold off on commenting on this until we are able to put that in front of everybody, because I think at this point, putting a score out would be arbitrary, not knowing how it's weighted, and if those weightings change or do anything, that could change how it happens. And, you know, that would be my suggestion.
My thoughts on this are that we shouldn't, I don't know if we should be defining cumulative impacts based on the DI score. I think it should be on where the point source emissions are, right? Because that's where the cumulative pollution is coming from. If that's a part of the score, I apologize, I don't recall that. But to me, it's like when we start talking about cumulative impacts and you're talking about you have 55 wells within a mile of your house, a couple miles of your house, or you have X amount of facilities that have water permits, air permits, right? Or you have X amount of Superfund sites and you're adjacent to a highway, right? It's like the actual factors of the pollution. And maybe that's probably in there and I'm just not remembering it.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ian, that we should sort of clarify. And I'm now switching to a screen share of EnviroScreen, and can thumbs up if folks can see it. Okay. So EnviroScreen has I think 37 indicators built into it, if I'm remembering correctly. That kind of come in different categories, and I'll just mention those are we kind of group all of the environmental factors, so pollution and climate burden, and then all the human factors, health and social factors together. Under that, we kind of have subgroups, but in the environmental exposures, we have kind of a variety of air and water and then noise indicators, some of which are based on the location of facilities. So we actually take essentially our entire APEN database, our air pollution emission notification database, for a variety of hazardous air pollutants or air toxics, as well as criteria pollutants, kind of standard air pollutants is built in here, and then also kind of locations where drinking water violations have occurred. There's also some essentially modeling based air quality metrics that take monitoring data and then extrapolate where we believe that the air pollution values will be highest. So it's a mixture of kind of where sources are physically located and then modeling to extrapolate exposures. This environmental effects categories is more what you're talking about, Ian. So it's areas where we know our stream segments are impaired by pollution, as well as the location of hazardous waste facilities, the location of mines, so sand and gravel pits, as well as kind of conventional hard rock and coal mines, Superfund sites, oil and gas locations, which is actually a density-based metric, facilities that have to submit risk management plans under the Clean Air Act because they're dealing with hazardous or explosive materials, and then areas where wastewater discharge happens. The climate vulnerability category is more just areas that are vulnerable to different types of natural disasters that are exacerbated by climate change. And then the rest of the indicators are sensitive populations, so folks who are more at risk for environmental health causes, and then various demographic indicators, including race, language spoken at home, education. So the long answer to your question is yes, it includes all of those. And it also includes a lot of other things that are amalgamated into a single score. That was a very long way of getting to that, Ian, if what you think it should really focus on is just the location of facilities that have pollution. That pollution and climate burden score is something that does just kind of bring in those environmental factors in EnviroScreen. So sorry if that was too long a response, but curious if that shifts or adjusts your thinking at all on that.
Well, I really appreciate you going through all those indicators. It seems like I need to spend like 2 hours playing around in EnviroScreen to really understand. But maybe as an example, could you show us, we could look at a location and look at the difference between just the environmental burdens and then what it would look like with everything else?
Absolutely. Shall we
Great
choose? Oh, go ahead, Michael.
No, great question, and that's a really great example. If you could do that, Joe.
I will maybe default to the Globeville area, Swansea, Commerce City area, if that sounds okay. Like if anyone has a preferred.
I honestly would maybe rather look at a rural location.
All right, well, in that case, I will default to the other area I usually use as an example, which is Lahana, because that's where a lot of my family used to live and some of them still live. So looking here in Otero County, you can kind of see different census block groups have different scores in Lahana, including kind of more rural areas and the outlying areas of the county. I'll actually scroll up a little bit so you can get Rocky Ford in here. So right now we're looking at just the EnviroScreen score overall. So, you know, it ranges from this lower score of 37 right in a more affluent part of town where Otero Junior College is located, And then kind of, I think the higher score of 71, 63, some higher scores elsewhere in the county. And now I'm going to switch it over to just the pollution and climate burden. So one moment. Sorry, the map is under construction right now. So if it does that reload, it means they're making an update. So that always happens when I'm presenting it. I'm so sorry. Okay, so I will go back to our zoom in on Otero County. I'll zoom out a little bit too, so we can get Los Animas and Rocky Ford. Okay, so again, EnviroScreen score. Now I will update it for pollution and climate burden. Oh my gosh, every time I do it, it's sorry. This will not happen once the tool is launched. This is really embarrassing, but let me try that one more time. I'm just gonna switch to pollution and climate burden score and zoom in. Okay, this is just not working. This is really embarrassing. One last time.
You don't have to be embarrassed, Joel. It's under construction. Like,
Yeah,
it's all good.
I'm so sorry. I think,
Our whole city is.
yeah, I think there are some
Yeah.
significant updates being made in the tool this afternoon. So this
And
is really
no
bad.
need to be embarrassed, Joe. Trust me, we're good. Like,
Well, that did not work, but I would encourage you all either on our launch date, June 28th, or before then in the beta version of the tool to kind of play around yourself and kind of see how that changes as you switch between categories of indicators.
Yeah, you know, I would like to see the two maps next to each other, but I do understand how the other factors like health access and how, you know, these indicators do add up to your cumulative ability to take care of yourself. But I'm actually interested in what you think, Renee. Like, if you think that, you know, we should zoom into the actual pollution, or we should be including these other kind of social pieces when making a decision on that.
We need to include more social pieces, in all honesty, or we're not representing community. We need to consider healthcare costs, other costs that we're not foreseeing, and that's where we're going to need more community involvement in this space too for cumulative impacts. We know the data for a lot of particulate pollutants and how that intersects in this space, but it's socioeconomically how that's impacting community in a way we are not foreseeing that is the real cumulative impact too.
Okay, so if we were to go that way, what you're asking is to choose a score number that would be applicable.
Yeah.
Either way, you have to choose a score number, right? So
Increase the severity to less and to less.
Yeah, and in my statement earlier about not being ready to do that is not understanding what the score really is at this point. You know, I mean, I get that all those are included, but are they all weighted equally? Do some of them need to be weighted more than others? You know, those are things that I think that's our job to look at if we are going to make a recommendation that this tool is used for state agencies.
I think we have to create a baseline historically too, because we need a starting point. So where have we been historically in certain spaces? Where have certain spaces been redlined, been known environmental racism zones or environmental particulate degradation zones, things like that, that we already know where there have been cumulative impacts historically. So we can start getting more context about where we're going to start actually creating it with even visually what that looks like as a cumulative impact.
Well, maybe Renee, you have helpfully moved us along, I think, to our next slide on the Jamboard. So thank you. And it seems like this is a topic we can come back to once EnviroScreen is launched and functioning. And the task force has had time, you all have had time to really digest the methodology. I could do my best to explain it right now, but I think there's no substitute for me all having a chance to just read the supporting documentation and play around in the tool once it's launched. So future subcommittee, and you know, Renee, to your point, we kind of already had some discussion about the demographic factors. So I wonder if we can just move on to the history of environmental racism next. And I think that you were kind of talking about maybe the answer to this question is that kind of a map of the areas that have experienced that historical redlining or other types of exclusionary policy should be included in EnviroScreen. Is that what you were getting at, Renee? Am I correct there?
Yes, because this is also a generational violence in some, that's why it continues being the same acceptable marginalized DIC communities. So it's creating where there's context and allowable harms or have been allowable harms.
Any other thoughts on this question? And then
Or-
because there is so much about the history of environmental racism, I'll flag, I have a couple different Jamboard slides with different questions about it. So.
School
Are there-
zone. Oh, I'm
Go ahead.
just the last one really quick. School zones will be key, especially to redlining. It'll help a lot. Just as an educator, it does often, just as a map, sometimes even help where there's been redlining.
Sorry, Renee, do you mean like a school district map?
Yes. And even the one that's currently been redistricted. So that's why context is really helpful. Thank you, Tyson.
No worries, there's an alarm going off outside. It's bugging me, so sorry, I keep looking away.
No worries, we can't hear it actually.
I was just gonna say, do we have data sets on like gentrification and things of that nature? Because again, I always think to the historical mistakes we've made when doing stuff like this and leaving these loopholes that certain communities can use to their advantage when they're not really who this is meant for, right? So, I mean, again, that's a really tough topic because a lot of gentrified neighborhoods still have, original homeowners in there. Some don't. But how do you look at that? Is that lower the score in certain communities? I don't know. I just don't even know what kind of data there is out there for that at all, if any.
The short answer is I don't think we currently have that data at CDPHE. I think that as Tova, who spoke to a few, or at our last meeting actually, wraps up her research and we kind of have it more formalized to present to the public and get comments and then start to map it in EnviroScreen, I think we could do a comparison analysis, right? For example, of census block groups that are identified as having that historical redlining, but for example, no longer have more than 40% people of color or don't meet the definition in another way. But it is a challenging topic. You're right, Tyson, because there are a lot of different ways to cut the data and inevitably it will leave out some really important lived experience.
Well, and that's where maybe we can, I've kind of always had the thought in my head that we use EnviroScreen as a starting point, and then the respective agencies are going to have to come up with something in their rules, because every agency has a different rulemaking policy or requirement, and they're going to have to put something in their rules that says this is how you verify that, and this is how you go in and make sure that that still fits the criteria for a DI community and or a overburdened DI community, whatever it may be called. And then they're going to have a set of rules based on, if you're in a DI community, you got to do an equity analysis. If you're in a DI overburdened DI community, you're going to have to do an equity analysis, and you're going to have to do this continual analysis for X period of time. There's going to be more things wrapped around that, but it's going to be so different in every state agency that it needs. And I think back, and Joel, you are very familiar with the COGCC rules and regulations. The applicability changes based on the situation to ensure that it's being looked at appropriately. And that's kind of what our recommendations need to make sure that, because I really do think it's a two-step process. We can't just throw a recommendation and all of a sudden the state agencies are going to be, you know, permitting a certain way. Their processes are completely different. So our recommendation has to fit all the agencies' process to ensure that they go through the next steps to come up with the rules and regulations necessary.
This is a hard one. I tend to agree with Renee on this one. I think that you know, there should be some acknowledgement of, you know, redlining and you know, a lot of the social harms that happened in the mid 20th century to people of color and women and low-income folks. Having said that, I also understand where Tyson is coming from too. You know, I mean, this is a tough one, but I think that at the very least, we should at least be able to acknowledge it, kind of like how we start our meetings. You know, with an acknowledgement, but I know for a lot of folks, that's just like, that's like surface. That's not like getting to the root cause. I just don't know how you. It's a tough conversation to have. That doesn't mean to shy away from it. But I'm rambling. I worry about the application though. To Tyson's point, to put a finer point on it, you know, how are agencies supposed to, and even industry, how are they supposed to address a topic like this? And I don't have the answer to it, but it's a hard one. Doesn't mean we can't talk about it. It's just the application. If I'm in an agency and now I have to do this, well, what does that mean? And are we going to give the agency tools to actually apply this? And I don't know if we have the authority to do that.
To some degree, we're only recommending. So the state and federal agency eventually has to take the accountability on themselves to recognize where their status quo has allowed this form of regulation to be creating, again, allowable marginalized communities. So for us to paint a broad brush that all of them have to go completely by this and this is how you're going to implement is not only an incredible burden for such a short amount of time of changing the status quo, but what we're really recommending too is that every state and federal agency has to have some form of reformation, of recognizing where there has been these forms of equity gaps, and to really look at it with analysis from here on out with these types of contexts, starting historically, or you're not going to be able to really know where you're going, because it does create a certain type of baseline, but it also creates where there have been consistent gaps even in their incompetence in state and federal agency to have already, I guess, been able to address these issues earlier on without the need of an environmental justice action task force. So we need to also recognize that we do have a lot of burden, but so do state and federal agencies to now meet us where we're at with that type of accountability if we're making these types of recommendations.
It's fair. Can I just make a note, Joe? You captured my points very accurately, sir. And I started rambling and you got all of that out and got what I was trying to say. That's a skill.
I'm doing my best. I will not pretend I'm always perfect. So please, this goes for you, Michael, Renee, Tyson, Ian. I've done my best to capture the ideas here on the Jamboard, but please, I think you all have editing power and can go back and correct anything if I heard you wrong or I didn't get the right idea. I won't pretend it's perfect.
Well,
I do.
Oh, sorry. I just want to say, Renee, you make a very good point about starting history. And again, it really depends on how we make the recommendation, but if you make the recommendation to start with EnviroScreen, you include all that history, and that sets off the next phase, which is make sure it's still applicable and go forward from there. I think that resolves that issue, right? So you're not using EnviroScreen to kick off something other than, hey, you need to take a closer look and make sure that that is all still applicable. EnviroScreen is really the way to capture history and current together, and then look at it closely, make sure that none of the circumstances have changed, and then apply additional regulations to that if it's still applicable.
Yes, to be able to make state and federal agencies realize where they're accountable to in DI communities and have possibly created further harm or lack of protections, or even community to have their own mitigation or influence on regulation. And then also DI communities to also identify themselves, because we're all at a relearning phase is what I'm still trying to like get at too, is that even DI communities are coming to terms with the levels of cumulative impacts as we speak. So as we kind of move through this, it's also state and federal agencies to see where they can support that too, and who we're accountable to on both sides.
Thank you all. And Renee, I will capture that thought in just a moment, or do my best to. I do want to give us a time check because that was a really great discussion. And I think we've made a lot of progress towards clarity on some of the recommendations and outlined some future questions that still need to be answered. It's actually time to take our break. And then when we come back, we'll be going to executive session. So this is for the purpose of the task force to receive legal advice from our attorneys, Emily, as well as Jack from the Attorney General's office, about the use of race in the definition of disproportionately impacted communities and an EnviroScreen to make decisions. You may recall this was a legal question that came up during the March subcommittee meeting. So task force members, that means you all need to go to a separate Zoom link, which was sent to you. You'll see it on your calendar invite when we come back after the 5-minute break, so that we can receive that legal advice in private. Members of the public will be back probably around maybe a little after 5:30, since we're a bit behind schedule to kind of transition into the public comment phase. So Emily, I will turn it over to you.
And I will be back on mobile too, Joel, just so when I relog in, if the case looks different.
Joel, are we doing like a formal exit into executive session? Okay. So pursuant to statute, I recommend that the task force subcommittee move to go into executive session to consider the agenda item. And I don't have it right in front of me. Joel, do you have it? I want to make sure I get the exact.
Sorry, I lost my mute button. For the purpose of receiving confidential legal advice about race being a component of the definition of disproportionately impacted community.
Okay. As identified on the agenda for today, this executive session is authorized pursuant to the provisions of sections 246402(3A), 1 and 3. 2 and 3 of the Colorado Revised Statutes and other laws that allow the task force members and the members of the subcommittee to enter into executive session. So we need a motion.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second.
A third.
Ian, would you like to call a vote on it as the chair?
Yes, I call a vote. All those that say aye, say aye.
Aye.
That's everyone. I don't think we go to no's or abstentions if everyone's an aye, right?
Right. Okay, I think we're good.
Okay, so task force members, we will see you in that other Zoom link at 5:06. We'll still have a 5-minute break.
Thank you. See you then.
Morgan, do you mind putting up I just realized I turned off my video too early, a slide on the EJ program recording computer that just lets folks know we're in executive session and we'll probably return around, let's say 5:35 or let's say 5:40, give it a full 35 minutes to receive public comment.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you both.
And then I will see you there.
Okay.
Is this still recording?
It is, yeah. We should leave the recording on just to show that the executive session happened, I think is the standard practice. So.
Yep.
Okay, I thought you mentioned to pause the recording.
Oh,
you're good.
we need to pause the Spanish recording so that
got it. Okay.
otherwise it will because we had to make the Spanish recording computer the host, it would default the whole recording to English, as we discovered the hard way that one meeting. So.
Okay.
Yep, all good. I will create a slide, put it up on my personal computer, and then I will see y'all there.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience with us being gone to that executive session. We will give task force members just another moment to rejoin, and then Emily can bring us back out of executive session.
I think Renee said she had to jump off, so I don't think we should expect her back.
Yeah, it looks like we have Michael and Ian, so maybe we can just go ahead and keep going. I'm sure Tyson will be here in a moment. So Emily, would you like to bring us back?
Sure. So we are now out of executive session. The subcommittee went into executive session to consider the agenda item to receive legal advice on the use of race as a tool as identified on the agenda for today. Discussion during the executive session was limited to those items and no formal action was taken. We're now out of executive session.
Okay, thank you. I think that puts me back in. We are going to be taking public comment. If you would like to make public comment, please just raise your hand and I will call upon you. JD, go ahead.
Unless somebody wants to go first. I just want to make sure I got on there, so.
You were the first.
Now I want everybody to hang with me, okay? I'm going to read this from the what are disproportionately impacted communities. This is from your own website. It says communities where multiple factors, socioeconomic stressors, disproportionate environmental burdens, lack of public participation, cumulatively contribute to persistent public health and environmental disparities. One thing that it seems like everybody seems to forget is rural Colorado. I watched a guy the other day with an unsheathed knife approach his son, stabbed in the air, torn him 3 times, followed by an uppercut with his right arm. When you look at these rural areas, they don't have a whole lot of access to hospitals. The radio reception is very minimal. They have access to only, like you might call them Christian radios. There's a very hostile environment that's happening out there. They're being left behind. Colorado themselves are actually establishing an environment that's going to be very hostile to everybody else. And then I also watched on C-SPAN when they were talking about racism. And they said a lot of the racists are actually picking up some of their racist vocabulary and their ideals from mainstream media. What we're going to have to do, and I really believe this, is start concentrating on some of those areas so that we're pulling them back into the fold. Because these communities, and told me gente vive en allá, a lot of my family that I grew up with were from areas like that because they're some of the farmhands. These are getting very dangerous areas. I suggest we don't forget about them. When you talk about these areas that are disproportionately with environmental burdens, and then now you add the idea that municipalities are buying the water from these communities. It's getting pretty bad out here. You remember, and I live in Windsor, but I still have friends and family that I talk to. If you ever hear like some of the stuff when we did this big push to make sure we get Democrats voting, a lot of these rural communities said nobody come out there. So if you really think about it, a lot of these areas are being ignored. And I noticed a lot of stuff that you guys have been talking about here has been dealing primarily with the central municipalities, which is fine, and because they need to be done. But what I wanted to stress as much as I can here is the environment is getting really hostile. We need to pull them out into the fold. And Mr. Excel, just so you know, I talked to somebody from the community. And they're pretty upset that the PUC has allowed Xcel Energy to go ahead and force these communities who are impoverished to pay for expenses they supposedly had over Texas. So I kind of say, as you guys do this, be cautious of the areas you go into. And then on that note, I feel like I have so much more to contribute, but I will say, I really feel that you're kind of complicating this thing. We're getting too many smart people in here that are highly educated. And I think we need to just get down to the reality of what's happening and approach this at a, I was going to say familial base, like a family. With that, I'm going to say goodbye, you guys. And I truly hope you're the best. And I also want everybody to know all this time, I really, truly meant the best for everything that's going on here. But I'll be a phone call away if you guys need me. Con corazón no metido. I really do, guys. I hope you all the best. I just see us going in the same direction we've done before. And anda.
Thank you, JD. Does anyone want to ask any questions of JD? Okay, is there anyone else present that would like to give public comment? Please just raise your hand. Okay, well, maybe we can take this time, Joel, and you can talk about next week's meeting.
Sure, and I might actually turn it over to Lubna to do that since she's been organizing and facilitating it.
Okay.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks everyone for your undivided attention over the past almost 3 hours. I think just today's conversation has been really productive, and hopefully we'll be able to incorporate some of this feedback into the draft that we share with you all on Thursday. Just to kind of give you all a sense of where we're at in the process. So as Ian mentioned, meeting 4 is coming up on Tuesday. I've touched base with all of our task force members here, and looking forward that all of you will be in person. So that'll be awesome for us to get to know one another and have just a really productive meeting. The majority of the meeting will be focused on looking at the draft recommendations. As you all remember, at the April meeting, we had kind of a very high level rough draft. And so this is kind of an official draft 1. I'll be sending that out on Thursday. And one thing I do ask of our task force members, so, Ian, Michael, and Tyson, and especially both of you being the co-chairs of the task force, is to please read through that document prior to the meeting on Tuesday. There is, you can't really get the full the full effect of the document by kind of reading it piecemeal, which is kind of what we've been doing in these subcommittees, because we have been hyper focused on, in this case, the definition of disproportionately impacted communities. But Tuesday's meeting is that opportunity for all of us to come together, for there to be like an ideas exchange. And while we will be going through the recommendation, the draft document, almost line by line, it might be a little painstaking at times, but I think this is what the task force needs to do at this point. We need to go through the document and really think about how to refine the recommendations, make them more detailed, vote on some recommendations. And the only way that I think we're going to have a productive meeting is if we kind of have everybody coming to the table with, edits or ideas about what they would like to prioritize or change in the draft, already coming to the table with that. So I just want to mention that for our task force members, we will be having kind of a task force only meet and greet starting at 9:15. So you'll see that the agenda starts at 10, but there's kind of a breakfast that's really just meant for the task force members to get to know one another, and then we'll officially start the meeting at 10. Of course, the meeting is hybrid, so while most of our task force members will be in person, there will be a couple that are going to be attending online, and members of the public that are not in Commerce City or not nearby are welcome to attend online as well. Morgan and I and Joel will be doing a run through at the Eagle Point Recreation Center on Thursday to work through all of the tech. So hopefully we will have a pretty smooth meeting. And the last thing I will do is I will just drop a a high level agenda for the meeting on the 21st. And feel free to take a look at that. And then Morgan, if you had the registration link handy, could you drop that in the chat as well for like Susan and Melissa, who might want to attend if you haven't already registered. But that's about it on my end. Really looking forward to seeing you all for a full day of good work.
Excellent.
Okay.
So am I.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you, Lubna, Joel, and team. And all my task force brethren and sisters.
Looking forward to seeing how tall you really are, Tyson.
It's all a hoax. I'm like 5'11".
It's a gym. We might have to hoop it up a little bit. I'm just saying.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward to meeting everybody in person and learning more about everybody personally and just having some time to spend with each other, because I think that's important.
Great.
Ian, would you like to put forward a motion to adjourn so we can?
Move that we adjourn.
So moved.
All right, everyone say aye. It's the three of us. I think we're an aye.
Bye.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone. See you on Tuesday.
Good night. Thank you, Gisela.